The storm rolled into rocky pines long before anyone realized how dangerous it would become. Dark clouds gathered over the Colorado mountains, folding themselves into the sky like heavy blankets. The wind pushed against the tall pines, their branches shaking as though the forest itself could sense what was coming. In the distance, thunder rumbled, low and deep, the kind of sound that settles uneasily in a person's chest. On the narrow trail above Pine Ridge River, a little girl's footsteps splashed through puddles forming along the dirt path. Harper Brooks had wandered farther than she meant to. What began as an innocent walk to watch the river rise had turned into something far more frightening as the rain thickened. Her small jacket was soaked through, and the air grew colder with each passing minute. A sudden crack of lightning split the sky. The ground trembled. A rush of wet soil broke loose beneath her shoes. Harper gasped as the earth gave way, pulling her down toward the muddy slope. Her hands clawed at the roots and gravel, but everything was too slippery to hold. The world tilted. The roar of the river below grew louder. For a moment, all she could hear was her own breath, sharp and terrified, echoing inside her head. Then, from the shadows between the trees, something moved. A shape, broad, steady, powerful. A German shepherd appeared at the ridge, as if pulled there by instinct. His coat was soaked by the rain, his breathing heavy, but his eyes, those deep knowing eyes, locked onto the girl with focus that defied the chaos around them. He didn't hesitate, not even for a second. With a burst of strength, the dog lunged forward, gripping the back of Harper's jacket with his teeth. The slope beneath them continued to crumble. Dirt and stones slid past their legs. The river roared below like a warning. Yet the dog held on, muscles trembling as he pulled her inch by inch towards solid ground. The wind howled louder. Rain pelted the mountainside. The world around them blurred into gray and thunder. But in that desperate moment, one truth stood out with absolute clarity. The dog was not running away from danger, but straight into it. When Harper finally reached the edge of the ridge, her small hands clinging to a patch of stubborn grass, the dog planted his paws firmly beside her, taking the full weight of the slide. His body shielded hers from the rushing mud. His growl rose above the storm, not in anger, but in fierce determination. Only later would the people of Rocky Pines ask the same question. How did an old rescue dog, one no one seemed to want anymore, appear at the exact moment a child needed him most? And how could he have known? The truth behind that moment, the truth behind his instinct, was a story waiting to be uncovered, a story filled with loss, healing, and a bond that would soon change every life it touched. But on that stormy afternoon, as thunder rolled across the mountains and the rain swallowed the sound of everything else, only one thing mattered. The dog had found her, and he was not letting go. The stormy moment on the mountain would later be remembered as a turning point, the instant when fate stepped quietly into the lives of people who thought their hardest years were already behind them. Yet every story, no matter how extraordinary the moment of rescue may be, has roots planted long before the crisis arrives. And in Rocky Pines, those roots began in a small wooden house nestled beneath the towering Colorado pines. Evelyn Brooks was the kind of woman many older Americans would recognize in themselves. Strong without showing it, private without meaning to be. Someone who had lived a long life marked by both deep love and deep loss, yet still kept her home tidy, her porch swept, and her heart quietly open. At 72, Evelyn had settled into a routine that was as steady as the slow rhythm of the forest around her. Every morning she brewed a cup of black coffee, the kind she had shared with her late husband decades earlier. She would sit by the window that faced the mountains, watching the sun climb over the ridges. The view never failed to stir something in her, a blend of peace and a lingering ache that had become a familiar companion. Her home sat at the edge of Rocky Pines, where the sound of passing cars quickly faded and the wind carried the smell of pine needles and cool soil. It was a simple house, no more than she needed, filled with photos of family, crochet blankets, and the framed firefighter's helmet that belonged to her son, Daniel. That helmet was the one object she dusted every day, the one object she never quite let herself forget. Daniel had been a wildland firefighter, the kind of brave soul who ran toward danger while everyone else ran away. 10 years had passed since the day he didn't return from a forest fire outside Boulder. 10 years since the knock on the door brought news that still lived in Evelyn's chest like a quiet storm. She didn't talk about it much. People in Rocky Pines knew, but they respected her silence. The older generation in America often does. They learned long ago that grief becomes something you carry, not something you display. Still, Evelyn kept going. She tended a small vegetable garden behind the house. She attended Sunday service even when her knees ached. She waved to every neighbor, even if the conversations were short. And every evening, when the lights softened and the forest grew still, she lit a small lamp under her son's picture, not out of ritual, but out of love. But despite her strength, Evelyn carried a loneliness that many her age know well, the kind that no phone call can fill, the kind that echoes in a kitchen meant for more than one. She missed companionship. She missed laughter, especially the kind that children bring without trying. And then, by early summer, life brought her exactly that. Her granddaughter Harper, 10 years old, curious and bright as a mountain sunrise, arrived from Seattle to spend the season with her. The girl carried a backpack full of books and an energy that filled the house instantly. For the first time in years, Evelyn heard the sound of small footsteps running down her hallway. For the first time in years, dinner included someone else's voice. Harper had her father's smile and her grandmother's stubbornness. She also had a desire to understand everything around her, especially the things Evelyn thought she hid well. One afternoon, Harper paused at the mantel and stared at Daniel's helmet. She turned to her grandmother with quiet curiosity. "Grandma," she asked softly, "why do you look at Dad's helmet every morning?" Evelyn didn't answer right away. Her hand brushed the metal gently. "Because," she finally said, "some things deserve to be remembered." What Evelyn didn't know, at least not yet, was that the summer ahead would bring more than memories. It would bring a bond she could never have imagined, one that began the very day Harper met a dog who carried scars of his own, and that dog's name was Ranger. And so, in the quiet rhythm of Evelyn's life, where the days often felt the same and the evenings settled into predictable silence, a sudden burst of life arrived in the form of a little girl stepping off a bus from Seattle. Her name was Harper, 10 years old, all freckles, curiosity, and boundless energy. She stood at the end of the gravel driveway with a backpack nearly as big as she was, waving at her grandmother with both hands as though she had been waiting her whole life to make that one gesture. The summer air was warm. The pines swayed gently, and for the first time in a long time, Evelyn felt something inside her lift. Harper had her father's wide smile, the kind that lit up a room without asking permission, and she had inherited Evelyn's quiet determination. The moment she stepped into the little mountain house, it was as if the walls expanded to hold her presence. She talked about school. She talked about friends. She talked about everything she saw from the bus window, as though she had traveled across the entire country instead of just 2 states. Evelyn listened, her heart softening with each word. There is something healing about the sound of a child's voice in a house that has known too much silence. Seattle had shaped Harper in ways typical of modern American kids. She was sharp, observant, and not afraid to ask the kind of questions adults often try to avoid. Yet beneath her bright personality was a sensitivity that reminded Evelyn of Daniel when he was young. Gentle, attentive, always watching, always wondering. It didn't take long for Harper to sense the undercurrent of sorrow in the house. She noticed how her grandmother lingered near the framed photographs on the living room wall, how she brushed her fingers across the fireman's helmet as though it were a fragile artifact rather than a piece of metal, how she paused before answering questions about the past. One evening, just after dinner, Harper curled her legs under her on the old floral couch and looked at her grandmother with thoughtful eyes. "Grandma," she asked, "did Dad like the mountains too?" The question landed softly, but it stirred something deep inside Evelyn. She nodded slowly. "He loved them," she said. "He said the mountains made him feel alive and safe." Harper leaned her head on her grandmother's shoulder. "I think that's why I like being here," she whispered. In that moment, Evelyn felt the kind of warmth she had not felt in years. The kind that comes when 2 generations quietly decide to meet each other halfway, despite everything they have lost. The days that followed settled into a gentle routine. Harper helped water the tomatoes in the backyard garden. She fed the bluebirds near the porch. She explored the forest edges with a sense of wonder that only a child could carry. And every night, she asked Evelyn to tell her stories about her father, not out of sadness, but out of love. There was one detail, however, that Harper couldn't quite ignore. Whenever thunder rolled in the distance, even when it was faint, Evelyn's eyes clouded over. The girl didn't press for answers, but she noticed, and she listened. What neither of them knew was that this quiet summer, meant only to be a peaceful visit, was about to take a turn neither could have predicted, because destiny was already moving toward them on steady paws. And destiny's name was Ranger. Summer and Rocky Pines had a way of revealing things slowly, almost gently, as if the mountains themselves wanted people to notice the important details in their own time. And just as Harper was beginning to understand her grandmother's world, another presence entered the picture, one that neither of them expected, yet both seemed quietly destined to meet. His name was Ranger. Ranger wasn't the kind of dog people overlooked. Even from a distance, he carried a presence that demanded attention. A large German shepherd with thick tan and black fur, streaked with age around his muzzle, and eyes that held the depth of someone who had lived more than one lifetime's worth of storms. He was older now, slower in some moments, but he still moved with the disciplined precision of a dog trained for duty. Before he ever set foot in Rocky Pines, Ranger had belonged to the Colorado Search and Rescue Task Force. He had been part of countless missions, searching for hikers lost in winter snowstorms, campers swept away by rivers, and families stranded after sudden mudslides. People in the emergency community still spoke his name with a kind of reverence usually saved for veterans or local legends. But every hero carries scars, and Rangers were not the kind you could stitch with needle and thread. Years earlier, his handler, a young man named Lucas Hale, had died during a rescue mission after a rock slide on Mount Elbert. Lucas had been brave, compassionate, and utterly devoted to Ranger. When he died, Ranger refused food for days. He lay beside his handler's empty clothing at the station, waiting for a voice that would never return. After that, he bounced from one temporary shelter to another, always cared for, but never truly understood. By the time he arrived at the Rocky Pines Humane Center, word had already spread. He's gentle, but he startles easily, one volunteer said. He's been through a lot, another added. Most people admired him from afar. Few risked getting close. But fate rarely cares about statistics. Ranger first crossed paths with Evelyn and Harper during the town's summer community picnic. The sky was bright. Children were laughing near the lemonade table, and the air smelled of grilled corn and sweet berries. Volunteers from the Humane Center had brought a few animals for adoption, hoping some families might find room in their hearts and homes. Ranger stood quietly near the shade of an old oak tree, wearing a red bandana that read, "Adopt Me." His posture was calm, but there was a distance in his eyes, a silent watchfulness that suggested he was present, yet still living somewhere far away in memory. A sudden rumble of thunder, faint but unmistakable, echoed across the sky. Most people barely noticed it, but Ranger did. His ears twitched, his body stiffened, his breath quickened. The sound triggered something deep inside him, something left over from a life spent racing into danger. He lowered himself to the ground, trying to steady his trembling paws. Harper saw it before anyone else. "Grandma," she whispered, tugging gently at Evelyn's sleeve. "That dog looks scared." Evelyn followed her granddaughter's gaze. She recognized that expression instantly. It was the same silent fear she had seen in the eyes of soldiers returning from war, the same quiet panic of someone fighting a battle inside themselves. Her heart tightened. Harper stepped toward Ranger, her movement small and careful, as though she instinctively knew she needed to earn this dog's trust. She knelt beside him and extended her hand, palm open, offering nothing but presence. What happened next would replay in Evelyn's mind over and over again. Ranger stopped trembling. Slowly, he lifted his head and pressed his nose into Harper's hand. The children nearby kept eating their ice cream. Adults continued their conversations. The world moved on. But in that small circle of shade, something extraordinary happened. Two souls, both carrying invisible wounds, recognize each other. Evelyn watched in awe. A warmth she hadn't felt in years rose quietly in her chest, as if the universe had just matched a broken piece of her world with another broken piece she didn't even know was missing. Ranger stayed close to Harper for the rest of the afternoon, following her with a gentle loyalty that felt natural, effortless, almost inevitable. By the time they left the picnic, Evelyn couldn't shake the feeling that this dog wasn't just passing through their lives. Something had begun, something none of them fully understood yet. And within days, that quiet beginning would grow into a bond strong enough to defy a mountain storm. From the moment Ranger pressed his nose into Harper's small hand beneath the oak tree, something in the air shifted. It was subtle, the kind of shift most people would miss if they weren't watching closely. But Evelyn saw it, and she felt it too. The picnic continued around them with the usual summer cheer. Yet for the three of them, the world had narrowed down to a quiet space where understanding passed without words. Later that week, the connection between Harper and Ranger deepened in a way no one could have predicted. It happened on a warm July afternoon, the kind with a mountain breeze carried the scent of sun-warmed pine needles and the soft hum of distant cicadas. Evelyn and Harper had stopped by the Rocky Pines Humane Center to drop off a box of old blankets. The center was small, run mainly by volunteers, and stood just at the edge of the forest where the first line of trees cast long shadows across the gravel parking lot. As they stepped inside, Harper's eyes widened. Rows of kennels stretched along the hallway, each holding a dog with its own story, its own past. Some barked excitedly. Others paced anxiously. But one kennel, the last one at the far end, remained still. Ranger was lying there, head resting on his paws, eyes half open as if caught between sleep and memory. Harper whispered, "Grandma, it's him." And Ranger lifted his head. The moment he saw her, the heaviness in his expression softened, not entirely, but enough that Evelyn noticed. He stood up slowly, his movements careful, as though he was reminding his body to trust solid ground again. Then he walked to the front of the kennel and pressed his nose through the bars. Harper knelt down. "Hi, Ranger," she said softly, her voice carrying a warmth that seemed to settle the room. "Do you remember me?" If anyone else had said it, the question might have sounded childish. But coming from her, it felt sincere, honest, and strangely fitting. Ranger let out a quiet breath, a sound that felt more like acknowledgement than anything else, and rested his chin gently against the metal. The volunteer on duty walked over with a surprised smile. "He's usually nervous with storms coming," she said. "But look at him. He's calm with you." Harper glanced up. "Storms make him scared?" "It's not fear exactly," the woman replied. "It's memory. Dogs like Ranger, they don't forget the things that hurt." Harper's expression softened. "People don't either." Evelyn felt her throat tighten. She realized that her granddaughter understood far more about loss than she had assumed. And somehow, Ranger sensed that too. The volunteer unlocked the kennel. "He trusts her," she said. "If you like to spend a few minutes with him, it might be good for him." Ranger stepped out slowly, his paws touching the floor with a kind of quiet grace. When Harper reached out her hand, he didn't startle. He didn't pull back. Instead, he leaned forward, pressing his head gently into her palm. The hallway fell completely silent. Evelyn watched, her heart caught between awe and something like recognition. In the way Ranger moved toward Harper, she saw the same instinct Daniel once had, the instinct to protect, to choose the vulnerable, to stand beside those who needed him. Harper giggled softly as Ranger nudged her shoulder. "He likes you," Evelyn said, her voice warm. Harper shook her head. "No, Grandma. I think he needs me." The truth of those words lingered in the air like a quiet revelation. And in that small shelter hallway, illuminated by the soft glow of afternoon light, a bond took root, one that felt older than the moment it began. A bond that neither Evelyn nor Harper could fully understand yet. But Ranger knew, and soon that connection would be tested in ways none of them could have imagined. The bond forming between Harper and Ranger grew stronger with each passing day. It was the kind of connection that didn't need words, the kind that settled quietly into the spaces between two beings who understood hurt in different ways. Evelyn watched it with gratitude and a growing sense of wonder. But beneath that wonder, she also felt something else. A faint uneasiness she couldn't quite explain, because Ranger was changing, not in a loud or dramatic way, but in the subtle, instinctive shifts that only someone paying close attention would notice. And Evelyn, with her years of reading patients' expressions and studying the quiet language of trauma, noticed everything. It began one morning when the sky was still clear. The mountains stood tall behind the house, their rocky edges golden beneath the early light. Evelyn was on the porch with her coffee. Harper was drawing her notebook at the patio table, and Ranger lay stretched across the wooden boards, eyes half closed in the summer calm. Then, out of nowhere, Ranger lifted his head. It was not a curious gesture. It was sharp, alert. His ears stood straight, his muscles tightened, and his eyes focused on a point far beyond the tree line. He rose to his feet slowly, as though listening to something only he could hear. Harper looked up. "Grandma, what's he doing?" Evelyn set her coffee down, watching him closely. "I'm not sure," she said softly. "But dogs like Ranger, they feel things long before we do." Ranger walked to the edge of the yard, his body stiff with tension. He sniffed a breeze, took 2 steps forward, then another, each movement deliberate. The forest seemed to hold its breath with him. Even the usual morning birdsong fell oddly quiet. A moment later, a distant rumble rolled over the mountains, so faint that most people would have mistaken it for a passing truck or the shifting of rock. But Ranger heard it clearly, and the way he flinched told Evelyn everything. Thunder, not close enough to see, but close enough for him to remember. His tail lowered, his paws paced the dirt. He looked back toward Harper, then toward the forest again, caught between instinct and fear. Evelyn recognized the conflict instantly. It was the same look she had once seen in her son when danger moved silently toward community, long before the alarm sounded. "Storm coming," Evelyn murmured, her voice barely above a whisper. Harper blinked. "But the sky is blue. Mountains can change the weather in a heartbeat," Evelyn replied. "And Ranger, well, he has lived through things most of us never will." For the rest of the morning, Ranger's behavior stayed strange. He circled the yard several times, sniffing the air as though searching for something that didn't belong. He paused often, staring up toward the ridges of Pine Ridge River. At noon, he refused his food. By early afternoon, his pacing grew sharper, his breathing faster. Harper knelt beside him. "You okay, Ranger?" He leaned into her hand for a brief moment, but his gaze drifted back to the mountains almost immediately, as if something out there, something invisible to everyone else, was calling him. By late afternoon, clouds had begun to gather, slowly at first, then in heavy gray clusters that dimmed the sunlight across rocky pines. The wind shifted direction, carrying the unmistakable scent of rain mixed with cold earth. Evelyn stood at the window, watching the sky darken. "It's coming," she whispered. Ranger had already moved to the door, sitting there with a stillness that felt unnatural. Not frozen in fear, but bracing, waiting, preparing for something no one else could predict. Harper followed his gaze toward the mountains and shivered, though the house was warm. "Grandma," she asked, "why does he look like that?" "Because he knows more than we do," Evelyn said quietly. "And I think he's trying to tell us something." What none of them realized was that the storm brewing over the mountains was not just a shift in the weather. It was the beginning of a night that would test every instinct Ranger had left and reveal just how deep his bond with Harper truly ran. As the afternoon darkened and the wind began to whisper through the pines with a warning tone, Ranger grew increasingly restless. He paced the living room, circled the front door, then returned to the window again and again. His instincts were no longer subtle. They were urgent. Something in the mountains was shifting, and he felt it in every muscle, every breath. Evelyn tried to calm him. "It's all right, boy," she said softly, though she wasn't fully convinced. "We're safe here." But Ranger wouldn't settle. He stood rigid at the edge of the rug, staring toward the forest as if invisible threads were pulling him forward. Harper noticed too. She closed her sketchbook and watched him with wide, thoughtful eyes. "He's worried, Grandma," she said, "like he wants to tell us something." Before Evelyn could reply, a sudden gust of wind rattled the windows. A distant roll of thunder followed, louder this time, unmistakable. The storm ranger had sensed all day was finally making itself known. Harper, eager to understand what had upset Ranger so deeply, moved closer to him. "It's okay," she whispered, placing her hand gently on his shoulder. "I'm here." Ranger touched his nose to her palm, but instead of leaning into her comfort, he stepped back, let out a low, urgent whine, and then bolted toward the back door, his body pressed against a hard, paws scraping at the wood as though begging to be let out. Evelyn's concern sharpened instantly. "Harper, stand back," she said, reaching for the latch. But before she could stop her, Harper had already opened the door. The moment the door swung wide, Ranger shot into the yard with a force no one expected. He ran toward the tree line, paused long enough to look back at Harper, and barked, a short, sharp sound that wasn't fear but a command. Harper took a step outside. "Grandma, he wants me to follow him." "No, Harper," Evelyn warned, her voice firm but trembling. "You stay right here. It's too dangerous." But children, especially ones with tender hearts and curious spirits, often move toward the things they feel, not just the things they understand. And Harper felt something powerful in Ranger's call, something urgent, something that whispered that he needed her. The wind picked up, carrying a scent of wet earth and rising river water. Rain began to fall, not a gentle drizzle, but heavy drops that struck the ground like warnings. Ranger barked again, and Harper made her choice. She stepped off the porch and hurried after him, her small shoes splashing through the forming puddles. "Harper," Evelyn cried, panic surging through her chest. "Come back." But the storm swallowed her voice, and Ranger and Harper were already running toward the woods. Within seconds, the trees closed behind them. Evelyn felt her heart seize. She ran outside, scanning the yard, shouting Harper's name into the thickening curtain of rain. There was no answer, only the wind, only the distant, trembling rumble of thunder crawling down the mountainside. Fear gripped her so completely that her knees nearly gave way. "Oh, dear Lord," she whispered, breath shaking. "Please guide them back." She rushed back inside to grab her coat and phone, her hands trembling, thoughts racing faster than she could form them. She dialed the local sheriff's department with a voice she barely recognized. "My granddaughter," she gasped. She followed the rescue dog into the woods. "I can't see them. The storm is getting worse." The dispatcher answered calmly. "Stay where you are, ma'am. We're alerting the Rocky Pine Search and Rescue Team now." But even as reassurance came to the phone, Evelyn felt an ache settling in her chest, because she knew something that the dispatcher didn't, something Ranger had shown her. A dog like Ranger never runs without reason, and if he had run into the storm, it meant the danger wasn't coming. It was already here. The moment Harper disappeared into the tree line with Ranger, time seemed to lose its shape. Minutes stretched into something heavier, something that pressed against Evelyn's chest until breathing itself felt like a task. She stood in the doorway, soaked by the rain, calling Harper's name into the storm that swallowed every sound whole. Within 15 minutes, flashing lights from emergency trucks illuminated the driveway. The Rocky Pine Search and Rescue Team arrived with the calm efficiency of people who had faced countless mountain crises before. But tonight, even they looked uneasy. The sky had darkened to a bruised purple, and the wind carried a cold bite that warned of something worse approaching. A tall man in a yellow rain jacket approached Evelyn. "Ma'am, I'm Captain Coleman," he said gently. "We'll find your granddaughter. Just tell us everything you know." Evelyn tried to speak, but her voice cracked. She followed Ranger, the rescue dog. He ran into the woods before the storm hit. The captain exchanged a tense glance with one of his team members. "Ranger?" As in the old SAR dog from the Hale unit. "Yes," Evelyn whispered, wiping rain and tears from her cheeks. He left like he knew something was wrong. Captain Coleman nodded, jaw tightening. If that dog went in first, he's tracking something. He wouldn't run without reason. The team moved quickly, setting up floodlights and coordinating radios. 2 drones were launched to scan the forest from above. Their quiet hum cut through the storm as they rose into the sky. Evelyn clasped her hands together, watching with desperate hope. But hope faltered fast. One of the drone operators called out, frustration in his tone. Visibility's dropping. Rain's too heavy. I'm losing the image. A loud crack of thunder rattled the air, and the drones rocked violently. Bring them down, Captain Coleman ordered. It's too dangerous. The machines descended shakily, their lenses dripping with rain. Evelyn felt her heart sink. The drones had been their best chance to cover ground quickly, but the weather was turning the forest into a blind maze. The ground teams pressed on, splitting into smaller groups with high-beam headlamps cutting narrow tunnels of light through the dark woods. They called Harper's name over and over. They listened for any sound, but the storm answered for her. Wind roared between the trees, bending their tall trunks like thin reeds. Sheets of rain pounded the earth, turning the forest floor into slick mud. The river, once a quiet stretch of water, now thrashed violently, swollen from the sudden downpour. One of the rescuers returned, breathing hard. The lower trails are flooded, he said. Pine Ridge River's rising fast. If the girl headed that direction, he didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. Evelyn felt her knees weaken. The captain steadied her with a hand. We're not giving up, he reassured her firmly. But the terrain is dangerous. We have to move carefully. Another rescuer approached, wiping his brow. We found tracks near the ridge. Dog prints. Big ones. But the rain is wiping them fast. Evelyn's breath caught. Ranger, she whispered. Yes, ma'am. He's leading the way, the man said. But we can't follow him, not with conditions like this. The truth settled over the team like a heavy fog. Humans were limited. Equipment was failing. The storm was gaining strength. The forest had become a tangle of hazards, mudslides, falling branches, unstable ground. Captain Coleman looked toward the mountains, rain streaking across his face. This storm wasn't supposed to be this bad, he muttered. If that dog is still moving in this weather. He is, Evelyn said, her voice trembling but certain. Ranger knows these mountains better than any of us. The captain nodded slowly. Then he's our best chance of finding her. But as the lightning cracked overhead and the rain fell even harder, the truth became painfully clear. The search team, with all their training and technology, could not keep up with what was out there. Not with the storm, not with the terrain, not with fate, and not with a dog who refused to give up on the girl who had given him back a piece of his heart. The deeper the night fell, the more hopeless the search began to feel. The storm had swallowed the last traces of daylight in the forest, usually alive with crickets and rustling leaves, had turned into a place of roaring wind and shifting shadows. Rescue lights flickered between the trees, but the darkness seemed to devour them one by one. Still, the search team pushed on, guided by discipline and experience, and a faint hope that Ranger and Harper were somewhere close enough to hear their calls. Then, suddenly, one of the rescuers shouted from up the ridge, I've got movement. Captain Coleman and Evelyn rushed toward the voice, their boots sinking into the mud with each frantic step. They arrived to find Ranger standing in the middle of the narrow trail, drenched, panting, and shaking rain from his fur. His chest rose and fell rapidly, but his eyes, sharp, alert, unyielding, held a clarity the storm could not dim. Evelyn gasped, Ranger? Thank God. Where's Harper? Is she with you? But Ranger didn't come toward them. He didn't nudge Evelyn's hand or seek shelter under the nearest tree. Instead, he took a single step backward, deeper into forest, as if signaling them to follow. A volunteer tried to kneel beside him. Easy, boy. Come here. We'll take you back to the truck. You're hurt, aren't you? Ranger growled, not with aggression, but with urgent defiance. He backed up another step, eyes fixed on the rescuers, body language clear. He wasn't here to be saved. He was here to lead. Captain Coleman understood immediately. He won't leave her, he said, voice low with awe. He's trying to guide us. The rain lashed harder, and a sudden streak of lightning illuminated the mountainside behind Ranger. In that brief flash, they saw it, the slope, the path, the rising water, the danger, and they saw why Ranger refused to turn back. The dog barked, short, sharp, demanding. He paced toward the ridge, then returned, Then pace again, a pattern unmistakable to anyone who had worked with search and rescue dogs before. Evelyn felt tears blur her vision. "He's telling us she's still alive," she whispered. "He won't leave her until we reach her." One of the younger rescuers tried again, holding out a blanket. "Come on, buddy. Let us check your injuries." Ranger ignored him, muscles taut, legs trembling with exhaustion but refusing to collapse. His fur was matted with mud. A deep scratch along his side bled slowly. His paws were raw. He had clearly covered miles of brutal terrain. Yet he stood there unbroken, locked on the only mission that mattered. Captain Coleman wiped rain from his brow. "All right," he said. "We're following him. Everyone stay tight. He knows the safest ground better than we do." Ranger barked once in agreement and bolted forward. The team followed, slipping and stumbling as they tried to keep up with the aging dog, who somehow moved with the determination of a much younger one. Ranger navigated through fallen branches, skirted around unstable rocks, and paused only long enough to make sure the humans were behind him. Then he pressed on again. Every few minutes, he looked over his shoulder, eyes fierce, as if saying, "Hurry, she needs us." Evelyn fought to keep pace, her breath ragged, her heart pounding with terror and hope. "Hold on, Harper," she whispered to herself. "We're coming." But the storm was growing more violent by the second. Rain cascaded down the mountainside like 1,000 tiny rivers, and the muddy ground shifted unpredictably beneath their feet. One rescuer shouted, "Captain, the trail ahead is unstable. If he goes any farther." "He's not choosing randomly," Coleman said firmly. "Ranger is taking us the only way he trusts." The truth was undeniable. The team, with all their gear and training, was being guided by an old dog whose instincts outweighed their best technology. Ranger stumbled once, catching himself on trembling legs. Evelyn gasped. "Ranger!" she cried. But he didn't stop. He pushed on, driven by something the storm could not break. Loyalty, memory, and a bond that had taken root the moment a little girl offered him her hand. The rescuers followed him deeper into the darkness, where the path narrowed and the roar of the river grew louder. Every step brought them closer to danger and closer to Harper. And as they pressed forward, one truth echoed through every mind present. The only reason they still had hope was because Ranger refused to turn back. The deeper they followed Ranger into the storm-soaked forest, the more it became painfully clear that no human could have navigated the terrain the way he did. The earth shifted beneath their boots. Branches snapped overhead. The river roared somewhere nearby, swollen and furious. The rescuers struggled to stay upright, but Ranger pressed forward with a desperate determination that made every trembling step of his feel like an act of love. Then, all at once, he stopped. His ears shot up. His body stiffened. He turned sharply toward the edge of a narrow ridge where the mountain dropped into a dark ravine carved by years of rain and rushing water. Ranger let out a sharp bark, one that sliced through the storm like a flare. Captain Coleman raised his hand. "Everyone hold. Listen." Through the roar of the wind and the crashing of rain, a faint sound trembled upward from below the ridge. It was soft, weak, but unmistakable. A child's cry. Evelyn's breath broke into a sob. "Harper? Oh, dear Lord. Harper." The rescuers rushed to the edge, their flashlights barely cutting through the rain. At first, they saw only mud, sliding water, jagged rocks. Then, as another flash of lightning split the sky, the beam of a headlamp landed on a small figure wedged between two boulders about 15 feet down the slope. Harper. She was covered in mud, her clothes soaked, her hair plastered to her face. One leg was pinned between rocks, and the water rushing past her reached nearly to her waist. Her tiny hands clung desperately to a root jutting from the cliffside. "Help!" she cried, voice shaking. "Please, I can't get out." Evelyn nearly collapsed, but Ranger was already moving. Before anyone could stop him, he leapt down the first drop of the ridge, sliding through the mud with controlled precision that defied the brutal conditions. He dug his claws into the earth, catching himself just before the slope could drag him all the way into the ravine. "Ranger, no." Evelyn cried, panic flooding her voice. But it was too late to hold him back. The rescuer stared in disbelief as the old dog navigated the dangerous slope with the instinct of a seasoned mountain rescuer. He inched his way down, slipping, catching himself, then pushing forward again, fighting the storm, fighting gravity, fighting exhaustion. Harper saw him and burst into tears. "Ranger, please don't fall." He barked not with fear, but with fierce assurance. A sound that said, "I'm here. Hold on. I'm coming." When he reached her, the water was rushing hard enough to knock over an adult. Ranger planted his paws wide, bracing his body like a living shield. He nuzzled Harper's shoulder, letting her know she wasn't alone, then positioned himself between her and the heaviest flow of water, taking the brunt of the cold, forceful current against his aging body. Captain Coleman shouted instructions from above. "Hang on, Harper. We're sending a harness down." But Harper didn't look at the rescuers. She held onto Ranger, sobbing into his wet fur as lightning flashed overhead. "Ranger," she whispered, voice trembling, "I knew you'd come." Ranger pressed his head against her cheek. Despite the water slamming into his back, he was shivering violently, but he didn't move away. He stayed exactly where Harper needed him to be, shielding her, protecting her, refusing to leave her side. A rock shifted near their feet, sending a spray of mud down the ravine. Ranger instinctively pushed himself closer to Harper, covering her with his body just as another surge of water crashed against them. The rescuers gasped. "He's holding her in place." One whispered, "He's keeping her from getting swept away." But it was more than that. Ranger wasn't just saving her. He was giving her his strength, piece by piece, as though every ounce of loyalty he had ever carried was meant for this one moment. Captain Coleman anchored a rope. "We've got one shot at this. On my count." The team prepared the harness. But Evelyn couldn't take her eyes off the slope. Her heart felt torn between gratitude and terror as she watched the dog she barely knew risk everything for the granddaughter she loved more than life itself. Ranger lifted his head just long enough to let out another bark, short, urgent, commanding. It was the same bark he had used earlier when calling them into the forest. A bark that said, "Hurry, she's still alive, but she won't be for long." The rescuers moved into action, their training taking over. The storm raged on. The river roared louder. But for the first time since Harper disappeared into the woods, the team had something they desperately needed. Hope, because Ranger had found her, and he wasn't letting her go. For a moment, time seemed to freeze on that rain-soaked slope. The rescuers stood anchored by their ropes above. Harper clung desperately to Root beside her, and Ranger, old, trembling, wounded, held his ground against the raging force of the mountain. Every lightning flash carved the scene into sharp, unforgettable images. Every rumble of thunder reminded them that the storm was far from finished. The team worked fast to prepare the harness, but the rising water below them had turned vicious. A new surge rushed down the ravine, stronger than the last, slamming into the rocks with force that made even the most seasoned rescuers flinch. "Hold steady," Captain Coleman shouted. "We're seconds away." But Ranger didn't have seconds. He felt the shift before any human did. The subtle vibration in the ground, the shift in the current, the sudden silence before another torrent of water barreled down the mountainside. His instincts, honed through years of search and rescue missions, told him one undeniable truth. If he stayed where he was, Harper wouldn't survive the next surge. And so he did the unthinkable. He moved. With a fierce growl of determination, Ranger forced his tired legs to step forward into the deeper part of the torrent, placing himself between Harper and the most dangerous flow. Water slammed into his chest so hard that his paws slid backwards in the mud. But he dug his claws in, fighting the slope with everything he had left. "Ranger, no!" Harper cried, reaching for him. He turned his head just enough for her to see his eyes, steady, brave, full of love that asked for nothing in return. Then he pushed his weight against the current again, bracing his entire body as a living barrier. The rescuers watched in stunned disbelief. "He's shifting the water," one of them shouted. "He's taking the force, so she's not swept off the rocks." Evelyn felt her heart break open. "Oh, Ranger, my brave boy." Mud and water hammered against the old dog, stealing his breath, numbing his limbs. But he refused to fall. Each second he stood, there was a miracle of willpower, a battle between instinct and exhaustion, a battle he had fought in different ways his entire life. Another surge came, worse than the last, and Ranger did something no one could have predicted. He lowered himself toward the ground, wedging his body between two jagged stones to create a wedge, a shield, redirecting part of the current away from Harper. It was not a move any untrained dog would make. It was the move of a seasoned rescuer, a dog who had memorized the language of danger and survival, a dog who understood exactly what was needed. Captain Coleman's voice cracked with awe. He's anchoring himself. He's keeping her alive. The rescuer secured the final rope, but Ranger held the line long before any human managed to throw theirs. Harper was shaking violently now, her fingers slipping from the root. "I'm scared," she whispered. "Ranger, don't leave me." Ranger pressed his head against her arm, urging her to hold on, not with words, but with the same silent strength he had shown since the moment he found her. His body trembled uncontrollably. His breaths came shallow. But he stayed. He stayed because she needed him. He stayed because he knew he had to. And then, as if the mountain itself wanted to test the limits of courage, another crack echoed above them. A large piece of slope gave way, sending debris tumbling down. The rescuers shouted warnings. "Rock slide. Move." But Ranger didn't move. He threw his body over Harper's, shielding her from falling branches and shards of stone. The impact struck his back with a sickening thud. A pained whine escaped him, but he didn't shift, didn't falter, didn't let the girl beneath him take even a fraction of the blow. Thunder rolled again. The river raged below. Rain hammered everything in sight. Yet on that perilous slope, in the heart of a storm no one saw coming, an old dog proved once more that love can override fear and instinct can defy logic. Captain Coleman clutched the rope, voice breaking. "We have to get to them now. That dog won't hold much longer." And the rescuers prepared to descend, finally understanding that Ranger had done the impossible. He had kept her alive long enough for them to reach her. But the storm wasn't finished testing them yet, and Ranger's greatest act of courage was still to come. Ranger's body shielded Harper with everything he had left. Mud poured around them. Water surged with unrelenting strength, and the mountain continued to tremble under the weight of the storm. Harper clung to him, shivering, whispering through her tears, "Please stay with me, please." Above them, the rescuers were finally ready. Captain Coleman tightened his harness and leaned over the edge. "Lower me now," he shouted through the storm. Two team members anchored the ropes, their boots sliding in the mud as they braced against the force of the wind. The captain descended quickly, the rope jerking with each gust. Rain pounded his helmet. The cold stung his fingers, but his eyes stayed fixed on the two figures below. "Hold on, Harper," he called. "I'm coming down." Harper lifted her head weakly. "Please hurry. Ranger's hurt." Ranger opened his eyes at the sound of her voice. The world around him was blurry, dimmer than it should have been, but he held on to the one truth he understood. She needed him. So he stayed in place, anchoring himself even as the current threatened to drag him away. Captain Coleman reached the first ledge and scanned the scene below. What he saw froze him in awe. Ranger, battered and barely standing, had positioned his body like a fortress around Harper. His fur was soaked, his side bleeding, his legs trembling violently, yet he refused to move even an inch from his post. "God Almighty," the captain whispered. He kept her alive. He signaled to the team above. "I need another line, and I need it now." Two rescuers moved with swift precision, securing a second rope and lowering it beside the captain. He clipped it onto his harness and descended farther, each step fighting against the shifting mud. "Harper," he called again. "Talk to me. Keep talking so I know you're awake." "I'm here," she managed, her teeth chattering. "Ranger found me." "I see him," Coleman said, voice thickening. "He did more than find you, sweetheart. He saved you." Lightning split the sky once more, revealing the full danger below. The river raged only a few feet beyond the rocks. Another slide could sweep them both into the water. They had minutes, Maybe less. Finally, the captain reached their level. He knelt beside Harper and placed a gloved hand on her shoulder. You're safe now. We've got you. Harper didn't respond. She was staring at Ranger. Fear and love tangled in her eyes. Help him, please, he's hurt. The captain nodded, throat tight. We're going to get both of you out. I promise. He unclipped a small emergency harness from his belt and quickly secured it around Harper, making sure not to jostle her injured leg. Rain ran down his face as he worked, soaking through every layer of his clothing, but his hands stayed steady. When she was secure, he turned his attention to Ranger. The dog tried to push himself upright, as if ready to follow, but his legs buckled. He slumped back down with a pained whine. Easy, boy, the captain murmured, brushing mud from Ranger's muzzle. You've done enough. Let us help you. Ranger blinked slowly, exhausted beyond comprehension. Yet even in this state, he nudged Harper gently with his nose one last time, as if reassuring himself that she was truly safe. Above them, the team began lifting Harper. The rope tightened, and she rose slowly, trembling in fear but holding on tightly as she ascended through the storm. "Grandma," she whispered weakly as she was pulled upward. "I'm coming home." Evelyn, waiting at the top, burst into tears. "Oh, thank God, thank God." But the rescue was only half over. Captain Coleman remained on the ridge, crouched beside Ranger. He touched his earpiece. "Lower the canine harness," he ordered, "and do it fast. He can't last much longer." A rescuer responded, "Coming down." Coleman looked into Ranger's eyes, the eyes of a dog who had spent his entire life running toward danger instead of away from it. "You're a hero," he said softly, "and we're not leaving you here." As the canine harness descended toward them, the mountain growled again. A loud crack echoed to the ravine. The ground beneath them shifted ominously. "Captain, move!" someone shouted from above. But Coleman shook his head. Not without him. Ranger lifted his head one last time, meeting the captain's eyes with a tired, unwavering resolve. Despite the storm, despite the pain, despite the impossible odds, he had accomplished his mission. He had kept the girl alive. Now it was a human's turn to save him. The moment Harper was lifted safely over the ridge and into waiting arms, the search team erupted in relieved shouts. But even in that moment of triumph, Evelyn's eyes stayed fixed on the ridge below, on the figure who had not yet been rescued. Ranger lay motionless now, his body curled against the rocks, beaten by the storm, trembling from exhaustion. He had given everything, and he had nothing left to give. "Bring him up." Captain Coleman yelled as the canine harness reached him. His voice carried a mix of urgency and reverence. This wasn't just a dog anymore. Not to the team. Not to Evelyn. Not to anyone who had witnessed what he'd done. With careful, practiced hands, the captain secured the straps around Ranger's body. The dog winced as the harness tightened over sore muscles, but he didn't resist. His eyes were barely open. His breath came thin and shaky. Still, when the captain whispered, "We've got you, boy," Ranger pushed his muzzle weakly into the man's glove, as if acknowledging the promise. "Pull him up." Coleman called. The rope tightened, lifting Ranger slowly through the rain. Mud and water cascaded down as his body rose inch by inch. The rescuers above leaned back with all their strength, fighting the weight of the harness in the storm's relentless pull. Finally, Ranger reached the top. Evelyn rushed forward, dropping to her knees beside him. "Oh, sweetheart! Oh, my brave boy!" Her hands trembled as she touched his drenched fur. "You saved her. You saved my granddaughter." Ranger blinked softly, but his body sagged, barely conscious. One of the paramedics knelt beside them. "He needs medical care right away. Let's get him to the veterinary center." They wrapped him in a thick emergency blanket, shielding him from the cold wind, and placed him gently into a rescue truck. Harper, despite her injuries, insisted on riding with him. Her small hand held onto the blanket near his paw. "I won't let go," she whispered. "You stayed with me. I'll stay with you." The drive to the Rocky Pines Veterinary Center was slow and tense. Rain battered the windshield, and the wailing siren cut through the storm. Evelyn sat in the front seat, gripping the dashboard, praying silently for a miracle. She had already lost her son to the mountains. She couldn't bear the thought of losing the dog who had brought a piece of him back into her life. At the center, veterinarians rushed Ranger inside. The bright fluorescent lights flickered above as they examined him quickly, checking his heartbeat, assessing his wounds, and monitoring his breathing. "He's hypothermic," one doctor murmured, "and severely exhausted. He's got bruising, cuts along his flank, and signs of trauma from falling debris. Can you save him?" Evelyn asked, her voice breaking. The doctor placed a gentle hand on her arm. "We'll do everything we can." Harper, wrapped in her own blanket, stood beside her grandmother. Her eyes were red from crying, but her jaw was set in quiet determination. "He's strong," she whispered. "He won't give up." The night crept on slowly. Evelyn and Harper sat in the waiting room, listening to the distant echo of thunder fading beyond the mountains. Nurses and veterinarians moved behind swinging doors, calling instructions, shifting equipment, fighting for Ranger with the same urgency he had shown on the ridge. After what felt like hours, the vet stepped into the room, removing her gloves. "He's stable," she said softly. "He's resting now. It will take time, but he survived the storm." Evelyn covered her face with her hands, tears slipping between her fingers. Harper ran to her and wrapped her arms around her waist. "He's alive, Grandma," she whispered. "He's really alive." The vet continued, her voice gentle. He kept going long past what most dogs, or even people, could endure. That kind of courage, it doesn't come from training alone. It comes from love. Evelyn looked through the small window into the recovery room. Ranger lay wrapped in warm blankets, his breathing shallow but steady. Machines hummed quietly beside him. Harper walked to the glass and pressed her palm against it. "I'll be right here," she said softly, her voice barely more than a breath. "Just like you were with me." And in that small, quiet veterinary room, surrounded by the scent of disinfectant and the fading echoes of a mountain storm, something shifted inside them all. The fear began to ease. The despair lifted, and the first fragile threads of healing took their place. Because Ranger was alive, and the family he saved was ready to save him in return. The storm had finally passed by the time Ranger settled into a steady sleep inside the recovery kennel. Dawn approached slowly, painting the sky above the Colorado mountains with soft strokes of pale gold and muted lavender. The world outside was still soaked and trembling from the night's violence, but inside the veterinary center, everything felt suspended, quiet, hushed, almost sacred. Harper had fallen asleep against Evelyn's shoulder in the waiting room, her small hand still clutching a corner of the blanket the nurses had wrapped her in. Evelyn stroked her hair gently, her eyes drifting again and again toward the recovery window, where Ranger lay surrounded by warmed machines and the gentle care of the staff. It was in that tender silence that a familiar voice spoke from the doorway. "Mrs. Brooks?" Evelyn looked up to see Captain Coleman standing there, his rain jacket slung over one arm, his face still marked by exhaustion. Yet there was something else in his expression, something thoughtful, almost reverent. "May I sit?" he asked. Evelyn nodded, careful not to disturb Harper. The captain took the seat beside her and let out a long breath, the kind that carried the weight of everything he had witnessed in the last several hours. "I want to check on the little one," he said. "How's she holding up?" "She's strong," Evelyn replied quietly. "Stronger than she knows." Coleman nodded slowly. "Kids like her, they make us believe in good things again." He hesitated for a moment, then continued. "I also want to talk to you about Ranger." Evelyn's heart fluttered. Is he going to make it?" "He's a fighter," the captain said gently. "But that's not what I wanted to tell you." His gaze softened. "I recognize him tonight, not just as a rescue dog, but from somewhere else." Evelyn frowned slightly. "What do you mean?" Captain Coleman leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "When I joined search and rescue years ago, there was a unit, the Hale Unit, one of the most skilled teams we ever had. They trained a dog that people talked about like a legend, a dog who could track through blizzards, who never abandoned a victim, who once stood guard over a lost hiker for 2 days straight until help arrived. The captain paused, his voice deepening with emotion. That dog was Ranger. Evelyn's breath caught. Coleman continued, and his handler, Lucas Hale, worked closely with another firefighter. Someone from this very town. Someone I remember well. He turned to face her fully. Your son, Daniel. The world seemed to still around Evelyn. The hum of the machines. The soft breathing of Harper. Even the birds outside appeared to fall silent. My Daniel, she whispered. He knew Ranger? The captain nodded. They were often deployed at the same time. Daniel once told us that Ranger had the sharpest instincts he'd ever seen, that he trusted that dog with his life. Evelyn pressed a trembling hand to her mouth. Tears filled her eyes faster than she could blink them away. Coleman's voice softened even more. I didn't realize it was the same dog until I saw how he looked at you. Dogs remember Mrs. Brooks, not just people, but the energy, the presence, the pieces of those they loved. He looked toward the recovery window. When Ranger saw Harper, Daniel's daughter, it must have been like something inside him clicked back into place. A familiar scent, a familiar spirit, something he was trained to protect. Evelyn felt her heart shift in a way she hadn't felt since the day she lost her son. A warmth rising through grief, a thread connecting past and present, a truth that felt both painful and miraculous. I always wondered, she whispered, why he came to her, why he didn't hesitate. Coleman nodded. He recognized her, maybe not in the literal sense, but in the way dogs understand the world, through loyalty, memory, and instinct. He saw something of Daniel and Harper. Maybe he felt he was protecting the family he once served beside. A tear slid down Evelyn's cheek. The captain stood slowly. You didn't just witness bravery tonight, Mrs. Brooks. You witnessed devotion, the kind that survives storms, mountains, and time itself. He placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. And Ranger, he didn't just save Harper. He honored your son. When he left, the room felt filled with a different kind of silence, warm, heavy with meaning, but no longer lonely. Evelyn looked again at Ranger, wrapped in blankets, breathing softly as machines hummed beside him. Harper stirred in her sleep and whispered his name. And for the first time in 10 long years, Evelyn felt something she thought she had lost forever. Connection, purpose, and a renewed understanding that love, real, enduring love, never truly disappears. Sometimes, it simply finds its way back home. The hours that followed were some of the longest Evelyn had ever lived through. Even after hearing the captain's revelation, after learning that Ranger had once stood beside her son on the worst days of his life, she remained seated in the quiet veterinary waiting room, unable to leave Ranger's side for even a moment. Harper slept curled in a chair beside her, exhausted but safe, her tiny hand still wrapped around Evelyn's fingers like an anchor. The night gradually gave way to morning. The storm clouds thinned. Soft light poured through the clinic's wide windows, settling over everything like a gentle blessing. For the first time since the chaos had begun, the world seemed to exhale. A veterinarian stepped into the waiting room with a warm, reassuring smile. He's waking up, she said. Would you like to see him? The hope that surged through Evelyn took her breath away. She exchanged a quick glance with Harper, who had stirred awake at the sound. The girl nodded eagerly, and together they followed the vet down the hallway lined with recovery rooms. They stopped at the second door on the right. Through the glass, Ranger lay curled beneath a thick layer of blankets. His breathing turned steady, the tremors that once shook his muscles now almost entirely gone. Bandages wrapped gently around his flank and shoulder, and a soft heating pad kept him warm. Go ahead, the vet encouraged. He'd want to see you. Evelyn pushed open the door slowly, and the faint beeping of monitors greeted them. The room smelled of antiseptic and clean linens. Ranger's ears twitched at the sound of footsteps, and his tired eyes blinked open. Harper rushed forward, but Evelyn placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. Slow, sweetheart. He's still recovering. The girl nodded and stepped closer with more care. Hi, Ranger, she whispered, her voice trembling with relief. Ranger lifted his head a little, just enough to press his nose against Harper's hand. His tail made the faintest thump against the blanket, weak but full of meaning. Harper let out a shaky laugh. tears gathering at the corners of her eyes. "He remembers me," she whispered. "Of course he does," Evelyn said softly, kneeling beside them. "You were the reason he kept going." Ranger shifted his gaze to Evelyn then, and something indescribable passed between them. A softness, a familiarity, almost as if he recognized the part Daniel in her. The same calm strength, the same quiet resilience. Evelyn reached out and stroked the side of his face. "You brave soul," she whispered. "You protected the most precious thing I have left. Thank you." Ranger closed his eyes for a moment, leaning into her touch with a slow, grateful sigh. For the first time since the rescue, his body relaxed completely. Over the next week, Ranger's recovery became a routine that brought the entire small town together. Each day, neighbors came by the clinic to check on him. The local firehouse dropped off blankets and treats. Children from Harper's age group drew pictures of Ranger wearing a cape, calling him Rocky Pine's hero. Harper visited every afternoon after school, sitting beside him for hours, reading him stories or simply talking about the little things, her favorite books, her worries, her dreams. Ranger never interrupted. He just listened, eyes half closed, tail wagging gently, as though absorbing every word she said. By the fourth day, the trembling in his legs had stopped. By the sixth, he was able to stand with help. By the eighth, he surprised everyone by taking a few unsteady steps on his own. "Look, Grandma," Harper cried, her voice bright with amazement. "He's walking." Evelyn's eyes filled with tears. "Good boy," she whispered, her hand against her heart. "You're coming back to us." The veterinarian's voice held warmth when she delivered the news. "With rest and love, he's going to be just fine. He's older, yes, and he'll need time. But he's strong, and he clearly has something worth fighting for." Harper knelt beside Ranger, wrapping her arms around him carefully. "You fought for me," she whispered. "Now we'll fight for you." Ranger nudged her cheek with his nose, his tail wagging more confidently now. For the first time since the night of the storm, the room felt full, not with fear or uncertainty, but with hope. Evelyn watched them, her chest swelling with a mixture of pride, gratitude, and something she hadn't felt in years, a sense of belonging she thought had been lost to time. The storm had tried to break them. Instead, it had brought them back together. And piece by piece, Ranger was proving that love, steady, patient, and unconditional, had the power to heal even the deepest wounds. As Ranger continued to heal, life in the Brooks household slowly settled into a rhythm that felt both familiar and beautifully new. Harper spent her afternoons curled beside him in the living room, reading books aloud or gently brushing his fur. Evelyn found herself humming again while making tea, small signs of a peace she thought had been lost forever. And Ranger, with each passing day, grew stronger, steadier, and more present. No longer a shadow of a dog who survived a storm, but a living reminder of everything love can hold together. And in that gentle return to ordinary life, something extraordinary became clear. The storm that nearly shattered them had also rebuilt them. It had stitched together the past and the present. It had bridged the years of silence between generations. It had brought home a dog who had carried the memory of a fallen firefighter and placed him back into the arms of the family that man had loved most. Ranger did not just survive. He became the thread that tied 3 lives back into one story. As Evelyn watched Harper lying beside Ranger on the front porch one quiet evening, the Colorado sun sinking behind the peaks, she felt a truth settle over her with undeniable clarity. Life will test us. Life will take from us. But life also gives back in ways we never expect. Sometimes, the ones who guide us through the darkest nights are not the people we expect, but the souls who walk beside us on 4 paws, carrying a loyalty deeper than words. For the viewers who have followed this journey, this story became more than a dramatic rescue in the mountains. It became a reminder of lessons deeply rooted in the American spirit. Lessons forged through hardship, perseverance, and love that does not quit when the world grows dark. First, that courage comes in many shapes. Sometimes it is loud and heroic. Sometimes it is quiet and unwavering, like an old dog refusing to leave a child's side. Second, that healing takes time. But when we choose to walk through life with compassion, when we choose to show up for one another even when hope feels thin, Healing always finds a way. And third, that family is not defined only by blood, but by the ones who stay, the ones who protect us, the ones who remind us that we are never truly alone. Ranger had done all of that and more. As Harper rested her head on his shoulder, she whispered, "You saved me. Now you're part of our family forever." And Ranger, in his quiet, gentle way, answered her with a slow wag of his tail. To everyone watching this story unfold, may you carry with you the reminder that love, in its purest form, is an act of bravery, that even in the storms of life, there's always something or someone worth holding on to, and that the smallest acts of loyalty can echo louder than any thunder. If this story touched your heart, if it reminded you of the animals or people who once saved you in unexpected ways, we invite you to share your thoughts in the comments below. Your stories carry power. They remind others that kindness still exists. Thank you for spending this time with us. Thank you for believing in hope, in healing, and in the incredible bond between humans and the animals who walk beside them. And remember, sometimes the strongest families are the ones built by love, not by blood.